Popular Culture in the 1920s by Sam Ives, Grace August, Sarah Dawes, and Mike Martinson. Mass media. Education increased throughout America. With education came literacy. With literacy came news chains. The mass media produced mass culture in America during the 1920s. By the mid-1920s, about 36 million Americans read newspapers. People stopped getting news from their local writers and instead switched to receiving news from the 55 main newspaper chains. Before they did this, there were over 800 newspapers. Magazines also took to the scene with some power. In 1921, Reader's Digest was invented, a magazine chain that took articles from the newspaper and compressed them into words people could understand. In 1923, Henry Luke confounded Time magazine, a magazine chain that interpreted the news in their own words. By the end of the 1920s, 10 magazines boasted a circulation of more than 2 million readers each. Although both these were more important advancements in the news, the most important was the radio. Very soon after its debut, many people began investing into the radio and wanted to know what the people wanted to hear. In 1921, Week began their regular news program, and by 1926, 3 more major radio shows emerged. Mass media provided a new sense of culture and education to the people of America, and with education, people became more involved in their government and their daily lives. Sports in the 1920s. Sports grew in the 1920s due to unprecedented publicity and promotion. Newspapers, magazines, radio, and movies all played a role in boosting the profile of sports. The 1920s was a transition period for many sports. It wasn't anything like today's athletes making big money and living extravagantly. Many athletes were amateurs that tried to simply make a living on what they could do best: play. Many school teams were formed for students, and several sports, such as golf, that had been previously unavailable to the middle class became open to everyone. Many great athletes existed in the 1920s. However, the best included Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey. Ruth, born on February 6, 1895, sits third on the all-time home run list with 714 home runs, 10th on the all-time RBI list with 2,213 RBIs, and first in on-base percentage with a .690%. Ruth also had a stint as a pitcher with a record of 94 wins to 64 losses. Another rising star at the time was professional boxer Jack Dempsey. Born June 24, 1895, Dempsey entered his first match in 1914 and maintained his dominance of the sport until his retirement in 1927. Dempsey holds one of the greatest boxing records of all time, having 60 wins, 7 losses, 51 knockouts, and 8 draws. Sports allowed the people of the 1920s to fulfill their dreams by vicariously living through their sports idols. Theater, music, art, and writing of the 1920s. Before this era, most plays in American theaters were modeled after European melodrama. This changed because of Eugene O'Neill, the first American playwright to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. His plays, such as The Hairy Ape, asked the Americans to reflect on modern isolation, confusion, and family conflict. Composers of concert music also began to break away from European traditions. George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue and Concerto in F brought him instant fame. They were among the first pieces to combine American jazz with a traditional style. American painters portrayed an America of dreams and realities. Edward Hopper captured the loneliness of American life in his paintings of empty streets, stark storefronts, and solitary people. Georgia O'Keeffe, however, painted intensely covered canvases that expressed the magnificence of New York. Many of America's gifted writers were divided by the values and lifestyles of the 1920s. Much of the work they produced was hopeless or critical of a society with few ideals to personal fulfillment. In spite of this, the fresh, insightful writing made this era one of the richest in literary history. Sinclair Lewis was the second American to win a Nobel Prize in Literature. In Babbitt, one of his most famous novels, he ridicules Americans for their conformity and materialism. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, he wrote about the wealthy people leading empty lives in extravagant surroundings. Art, literature, and music shaped America in the 1920s by providing a sense of individuality to its proud people and by giving them different forms of entertainment. The world of flappers. In the 1920s, after World War I, girls started to become more adventurous with the way they acted. They adapted an eat, drink, we will die tomorrow kind of spirit. They showed more skin in the clothes they wore. Their clothes were trimmed down and lighter, which made movement easier. Their skirts were just below their knee, and they wore flesh-colored stockings. The hairstyle was a short cut called a bob, which they covered up with a bell-shaped hat. Flappers wore more makeup than most. The big thing was wearing bright lipstick and eyeliner. Flappers acted like the youth. Their lives were full of fast living, blunt truthfulness, and a lot of sexual behavior for that time. To have a good time, they smoked and drank alcohol. To hold their drinks, they would carry around flasks attached to their hip. The dancing style of jazz dawned, which they were all for. At parties and dances, flappers and young men would dance what was considered closely. When the car was invented, they used it for more than one thing. They used it for driving and for sexual activity. They wanted to be more independent, so they drove themselves around, which was a different concept in the 1920s. The flappers of the 1920s exhibited a freedom in women that before was considered unheard of and shocking.